Donald Trump didn't announce a trade war this week. There was no emergency declaration, no dramatic signing ceremony, no televised ultimatum. And yet, something significant just happened in North America's trade relationship. Quietly. Canada and its provinces moved in rare unison. That alone should get attention, because Canadian provincial unity doesn't happen easily, and it doesn't happen without cause. At the center of this moment is Donald Trump's renewed use of tariff pressure as leverage. A strategy he has used before, a strategy that worked politically but produced complex economic consequences. And now Canada is responding in a way U.S. officials may not have expected. This isn't about a single tariff rate. It's about confidence. Confidence in predictability, confidence in supply chains, confidence that economic pressure won't escalate without warning. From Ottawa's perspective, the concern isn't just economic damage, it's precedent. When tariffs are used as a political tool, and especially between allies, and they introduce uncertainty into systems that depend on stability, that uncertainty spreads fast. Canadian provinces understand this deeply. Their economies are tied directly to U.S. markets. Energy, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation. When tariffs enter the picture, provinces feel it immediately, often before national governments do. That's why this response matters. It's not symbolic, it's defensive. Provincial leaders are signaling that retaliatory options are being considered not as threats, but as contingencies, insurance. This kind of coordination tells us something important. Canada isn't reacting emotionally, it's reacting strategically. And here's where Trump's role becomes central. During his presidency, Trump demonstrated a willingness to use tariffs aggressively, including against allies, to extract concessions or signal strength. That approach reshaped how partners assess risk. For Canada, the lesson wasn't the U.S. is hostile. It was the U.S. can act suddenly. That distinction changes planning. Trade relationships depend less on goodwill than on assumptions. Assumptions about continuity, assumptions about escalation thresholds, assumptions about restraint. When those assumptions weaken, governments don't wait for damage. They prepare. That's what we're seeing now. Canadian provinces are aligning publicly and privately to send a clear message. Trade pressure will not be absorbed silently, not because Canada wants confrontation, but because silence can be misread as acceptance. This matters for the United States too, because the U.S. economy is deeply intertwined with Canada's. Supply chains cross the border multiple times before a product is finished. A tariff at one point reverberates everywhere else. Economists warn that retaliatory cycles often hurt domestic consumers more than foreign governments. Prices rise, costs shift, margins shrink. That's why this moment is being watched closely inside Washington, not as a crisis, but as a test of whether tariff pressure still works the way it once did, a test of whether allies will absorb costs quietly or coordinate resistance, and coordination changes the calculus. This is not yet a trade war, but it is a signal that escalation would not be one-sided. Trump's strategy has always relied on leverage, but leverage only works when the other side believes backing down is cheaper than pushing back. Canada's response suggests that assumption may be changing. In the next part, we'll look closely at why provincial unity changes everything, how this affects U.S. businesses directly, and why trade pressure between allies often produces outcomes neither side intended. Because when economic tools become political signals, consequences multiply. Why Canadian unity changes the trade equation, and why the U.S. feels it first. What makes this moment different from previous trade tensions isn't the tariff itself, it's who is responding. Canada's provinces rarely act in lockstep on trade issues. They compete with each other. They protect local industries. They negotiate separately with Ottawa. So when provinces move together, it signals something deeper than politics. It signals risk perception. Provincial leaders are closest to the economic ground. They see supply disruptions first. They hear from manufacturers first. They feel consumer pressure first. When they align, it usually means the costs are already visible. This is why Canadian unity matters more than a federal statement. It means pressure is being felt across regions, not just in Ottawa's political calculations. For the United States, this has immediate implications. U.S.-Canada trade isn't abstract, it's operational. Auto parts cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. Energy flows are integrated at the grid level. Agricultural goods move daily, not monthly. Tariffs introduced at any point ripple instantly. That's why economists warn that tariff escalation between the U.S. and Canada often acts like a self-inflicted tax. American consumers pay higher prices. American manufacturers absorb higher input costs. American exporters face retaliation in markets they depend on. This is where Trump's tariff strategy faces its biggest constraint. It works best against fragmented counterparts. It works less well against unified ones. Canada's response suggests it has learned from past cycles, not just how to respond, but when to respond, early, before uncertainty hardens. And that timing matters. Markets react to signals faster than policy. Businesses pause investments before laws change. Supply chains reroute before tariffs hit. That's why officials inside Washington are watching this carefully. Not because Canada is threatening, but because Canada is coordinating. Coordination reduces leverage. It removes the option of pressuring one region while isolating another. It also shortens the time window for concessions. From a U.S. perspective, this creates a dilemma: push harder and risk coordinated retaliation, pull back and risk appearing weak on trade enforcement. This tension explains why the response from Washington has been cautious. Statements emphasize dialogue. Officials avoid definitive timelines. There's an effort to keep the issue from escalating publicly, because once escalation becomes public, it becomes political. And once it becomes political, compromise becomes harder. Trump's earlier trade battles showed this clearly. Tariffs generate headlines, but undoing them quietly is difficult. Canadian provinces understand that dynamic, which is why their message isn't loud. It's firm. They're signaling readiness, not hostility, preparedness, not provocation. This approach puts pressure back on Washington. It forces U.S. policymakers to consider domestic costs alongside strategic goals. That's the quiet power of coordinated resistance. It doesn't confront directly, it changes incentives. In the next and final part, we'll step back and ask the bigger question: what does this moment tell us about the future of U.S. trade strategy? Has tariff leverage lost effectiveness against allies? And what happens when economic pressure no longer produces quick compliance, but coordinated pushback instead? Because the outcome here won't just affect Canada. It will shape how the U.S. uses economic power going forward. Because when economic tools become political signals, consequences multiply. What this means for U.S. trade power and why the old playbook is fading. The larger question now isn't whether Canada will retaliate, it's whether tariff pressure still works the way it used to. Because what's unfolding here suggests something deeper. Economic leverage is losing effectiveness when allies prepare together instead of reacting separately. For decades, U.S. trade power relied on asymmetry. The United States could move first. Others would absorb the shock. Negotiations would follow. That model assumed fragmentation on the other side. Canada's response challenges that assumption, not by rejecting trade outright, but by neutralizing surprise. Once retaliation is anticipated, leverage weakens. Once costs are shared internally, pressure dissipates. And once allies coordinate early, escalation becomes expensive for everyone, including the initiator. This is the constraint facing tariff-based strategies today. They were designed for a world where trade partners acted individually, but supply chains no longer work that way. North American trade is deeply integrated. You can't punish one node without affecting the entire system. That includes the U.S. economy. This is why economists consistently warn that tariffs between the U.S. and Canada behave differently than tariffs against distant competitors. They act like domestic friction. They raise costs internally. They slow growth internally. They generate political backlash internally. That backlash is already visible. U.S. manufacturers raise concerns quietly. Retailers warn about price confirmation. Agricultural producers worry about market access. These pressures don't show up immediately. They accumulate. And once they do, reversing course becomes politically complicated. That's the paradox of tariff power. It's easy to apply, hard to unwind. Donald Trump's trade approach demonstrated this clearly. Tariffs were announced quickly, but rolling them back required negotiations, exemptions, and political justification. Canada understands this dynamic, which is why its response is structured to raise long-term costs rather than provoke short-term confrontation. This moment also reveals something broader. Allies are no longer assuming that U.S. trade policy will remain stable across political cycles. That assumption once anchored global markets. It no longer does. So allies plan differently. They diversify supply routes. They secure alternative markets. They reduce single-point exposure. None of this weakens the United States immediately, but it changes the architecture of dependence. And architecture matters more than headlines. The risk for the U.S. isn't isolation, it's diminished leverage. When partners believe they can absorb or counter economic pressure collectively, trade tools lose precision. They become blunt. Blunt tools create collateral damage. That's why this moment matters beyond Canada. Other allies are watching closely, not to pick sides, but to learn lessons. If coordinated resistance works here, it becomes a template, not for confrontation, but for resilience. That's the quiet shift taking place. The United States still has enormous economic power, but power functions best when it's predictable, when it's integrated into stable expectations, when allies don't feel compelled to hedge against it. Restoring that predictability doesn't require abandoning trade enforcement. It requires clarity, consistency, and restraint, because once allies learn to prepare for volatility, they rarely stop, even when conditions improve. This is the challenge facing U.S. trade strategy now, not winning the next dispute, but preventing the next one from being pre-planned against. Canada's unified response is a warning signal, not of rebellion, but of adaptation. And adaptation, once institutionalized, reshapes the system, quietly, permanently. That's the real takeaway. This isn't about a tariff headline. It's about how economic power evolves when pressure stops surprising and starts being expected. When that happens, leverage doesn't disappear, it disperses. And dispersed leverage changes how the world negotiates with the United States. It's firm. They're signaling readiness, not hostility, preparedness, not provocation. This approach puts pressure back on Washington. It forces U.S. policymakers to consider domestic costs alongside strategic goals. That's the quiet power of coordinated resistance. It doesn't confront directly, it changes incentives. In the next and final part, we'll step back and ask the bigger question. What does this moment tell us about the future of U.S. trade strategy? Has tariff leverage lost effectiveness against allies? And what happens when economic pressure no longer produces quick compliance, but coordinated pushback instead? Because the outcome here won't just affect Canada. It will shape how the U.S. uses economic power going forward. Because when economic tools become political signals, consequences multiply.